Hi everyone, welcome to Lovelace Institute's webinar on deliberating rapidly and online about COVID-19 technology. This webinar is part of a collaboration, so we're hosting this in collaboration with the Lovelace Institute, and it is reflecting on some of the emerging findings from an online deliberative process that we ran and we hosted over a period of 3 weeks, convening 7 workshops with a range of participants from all walks of life to think about what would build public confidence in the use of COVID-19 technologies. Thank you very much for your interest in this process and for joining us. I really appreciate your engagement and your interest, and we really very much encourage question, comment, observation. Do feel free to put them in the Q&A box. Great. So who we are, Ada Lovelace Institute, as many of you will know, are an independent research organisation that focuses on data and AI, and we worked on the content and providing subject matter expertise in this space, and we're also doing a lot of thinking about how to translate the findings from this work into policy impact. Traverse are an independent research and engagement consultancy, and they designed and delivered the deliberation process. Involve are an independent public participation organisation who offered us challenge and feedback on the process. And Bang the Table are an organisation that enabled a slightly different type of online engagement, which was reflecting through journals and storytelling on an online platform called Engagement HQ. So the process was run considering the question, what would help build public confidence in the use of COVID-19 exit strategy technologies? And we were thinking about a range of technologies, not just the digital contact tracing app, which of course has been the subject of much public debate, but also symptom tracking and the range of data architectures and infrastructures that are being used to understand and respond to COVID-19. And one of the things I'd like to flag before we welcome our speakers and our panelists is the nature of the time frame within which this online public deliberation happened, and this is what we think makes it quite unusual. Very shortly after the Isle of Wight contact tracing trial began, we began our deliberations. Midway through the process, the Dominic Cummings story broke. We then had the conversation, the death of murdering of George Floyd, and protests erupted across the USA. And during the course of this deliberative process, many participants were reflecting on some of these events and changes. And one of the really interesting aspects of this process was the extent to which there was a fluidity in the way that people engage with and thought about that. We're quite lucky because we've got Russell and Mandy who were part of the process, who will be able to reflect on that. And one of the really striking elements to this entire process was the issue of feeling, and the importance of feeling that we're all in this process together, of managing the exit strategy, of enabling a safe moment where people felt that they were able to contribute to the effort, but some of the events that felt increasingly like they may have undermined that sense of social solidarity. And I'm hoping that Russell and Mandy will be able to talk a little bit about that, and also Natalie and Anna. What was really striking from our perspective was the whole system emphasis that this deliberation generated, the extent to which people recognise the challenges and the limitations of simply focusing on the technology rather than thinking about how the technology was situated within a hotly contested conversation about what it meant for the government in the UK to leave lockdown, and what it meant for us to think about the impact upon different groups. So economic protections, for instance, were mooted. So, I mean, I think that I will leave it at that. I'm going to ask Russell and then Mandy and Natalie to introduce themselves. So Russell, would you be able to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name's Russell. I live in Kent and I'm a small business owner in the hospitality sector.
Thank you. Mandy? You're on mute.
Sorry. My name's Mandy. I actually live in Surrey, but spent an awful lot of my time in Camden caring for my dad. My background is IT, specifically the data management side of things.
Thank you. Natalie?
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Natalie Banner. I lead an initiative called Understanding Patient Data, which is hosted at the Wellcome Trust. And I was involved in this process as an expert witness for one of the sessions.
Thank you. Anna?
Hi, everybody. My name's Anna McKeown. I'm the head of engagement at Traverse, and Traverse worked together with the Lovelace Institute around the table and involved to deliver the discussion, the deliberation process.
Thank you. So Russell, if I might turn to you first, I'd like to ask you what you found interesting about the process, what were your reflections on your experience and what you thought the key emerging insights and findings were?
Sure. So I really enjoyed the format that was proposed. I thought it was good for people to be able to connect in specific areas around the country without leaving your house. I do think this will probably be the new greener form in the future of how people sort of talk to each other, business and commerce. I think the bubble of being able to be at home and being able to project your thoughts safely is a huge plus point. Sometimes face to face, I'm not always good at projecting what I want to, but I felt very safe in being able to give my opinion on that. The presentations were phenomenally useful. They were clear and concise, which then led to better debate, I found. And the moderated follow-up questions, again, were very useful. I think they're quite a powerful tool to be able to bring all the information together. So Zoom, that was quite a good plus pointer, I think. I would have been happy to carry on and debate longer in our breakout groups. Sometimes I felt like we got to pivotal points and we didn't quite clear up everything that we needed to. Maybe we could have another option into that people could stay on if they wanted. Mind you, I think probably some of us could have gone on all night, but I think that would be good. I did feel at a couple of points in the process that we didn't quite have all the facts that we might have needed to make informed decisions. I appreciate that was quite difficult with what was going on at the time. And it's tricky today as well with the media and stuff and lots going on. It's really hard to get hard facts, I feel. So that's what I sort of thought with the pros and cons of the actual process. So obviously I'm from the hospitality industry, and following on from Tuesday's announcements regarding the reopening of hospitality, it's emerged that businesses will be required to log all people entering their establishments to aid with track and trace. This is obviously a primitive form of what I was hoping for when I started the process with you. I was hoping that I might be able to see the technology of an app that could get me back to doing weddings and events quickly, some sort of tracing app that would be linked to the main app with a medical certificate, where we could talk about getting a lot of people into a smaller space again. I've obviously seen that there's a bit of panic already about the data handling, and I'm a little bit puzzled by this because we do this every day. You book a table in a restaurant, they ask for your telephone number, your address. Some restaurants take your credit card details. So just a slight extension of this. I just see it as a natural progression, and if we can help save lives through that, I just think it's a small price to pay. I mean, there's other instances as well where, you enter a building and you're asked to give your details as you enter the building to safeguard. With the country as it is and quite vulnerable, we're being encouraged to open up lots of stuff to save the economy, but we're still quite vulnerable to the virus. So I think, you know, people's civic duty just to give their information over, I think that's a small price to pay for us all to sort of get back to the normal. So I suppose sort of taking us on to what we learn, I think the main thing is people want to feel safe. And I think whether that's physically or digitally, people want that safety. The biggest word I think that was used over the 3 weeks was transparency. And it came up over and over again. I think there's a lot of distrust in the country's machine. I think it comes from a lack of education of the public in terms of data handling. You know, it almost, some of it feels a little bit cloak and dagger with your cookies and things like that. And also, I feel that maybe the government missed an opportunity at the beginning to sort of be as transparent as possible, and maybe you'll make us feel a little bit more secure when that happens. I, for one, I know my data's out there and I'm quite comfortable with it. So I sort of came from a point of view that, you know, I was quite blasé to the fact, but obviously there were a lot of other people in the group that weren't so as willing to give their data up. I was shocked by some of the statements. Some people were very sort of not interested in giving up their data for anything, and I just found it quite bizarre from the way that I come on that sort of aspect. I think the other thing that we learned was that maybe that if there's apps like this, they don't need to be fronted by politicians. Maybe coming directly from the NHS, and obviously their stock being quite high at the moment, that people would feel more willing to give up data. They would trust the NHS more. The NHS has had breaches in the past, but one of our panelists made a good point that the NHS is made of lots of subsidiaries, and you know that probably wouldn't come into play. So I think that would be a good way of a trust issue being resolved there. Finally, I think we sort of learned that there's no perfect solution. We won't please everyone, but you know, we should try if we can. I think as long as we can sort the transparency, I think there was a good feeling that, you know, to have a go and try and do that. And this could be the key to open up society fully again, I think. Okay.
Thank you. So that's really rich and really interesting. And I was really struck by one of the aspects of the deliberation, which is the importance of an evidence base, or the development of an evidence base around the effectiveness of a range of COVID-19 technology. And there's all sorts of reasons for why that might be particularly challenging, particularly in times of pressure. But one of the key themes that did seem to emerge from the deliberations were the evidence base around the Isle of Wight contact tracing app trial, but also a global evidence base. And one of the big challenges is, of course, the rate of change makes it very difficult to gather and share facts, and actually that made it quite challenging for Ada Lovelace Institute involved Traverse to design. And I will ask Anna to reflect on that very shortly. I'd like to invite Mandy into the discussion and to also offer her own observations on the process and how that works.
I feel very passionately that technology should be used more for the benefit of society. I mean, I've spent a lot of time on the commercial side of things, and probably my last 3 big projects have been marketing, number crunching, shopping habit buying type systems. But I honestly felt that the technology was there in some form that could actually support us through this process. And very quickly, actually, I discovered that some of the assumptions around the technology, i.e. Bluetooth and whether it would actually be suitable for this, it seemed to have been ignored, and someone was ploughing on with all of this. I mean, I learned, interestingly enough, I absolutely agree with Russell. I was very intrigued about people's views around the data and data sharing as far as this is concerned. Because ironically, as an example, a lot of people I know, and I'm sure a lot of people who were involved in this, have probably got public profiles on Facebook. They're sharing their address, they're sharing their date of birth, i.e. their birthday. They're sharing information about where they've worked, where they went to school. which is actually very powerful in the hands of a, you know, a scammer, basically. So I was quite relaxed about my data. I think for me, what was interesting on that side was how little people understood about the GDPR legislation, the General Data Protection, the GDPR basically. Because a lot of the concerns people had about looking after the data, how it was shared and how it used, should be covered by that legislation. So I felt quite comfortable around that. So I agree with Russell as far as the data issues. One thing for me that I felt very strongly about was accessibility around the technology, because the whole app business relied on people having a phone, and two, having a phone that would actually run the software. And that actually is not the case for a large number of people in society currently. So a lot of people will have been left out of this process, and I felt quite strongly that whoever it was who designed this application architecture hadn't really addressed that, and we did discuss issues around that. I think in terms of the impact and effectiveness around the application, again, following on a lot with what Russell has said, and I mean what you've just said, is because we'd not seen the project specification for this app, we weren't aware of what good looked like. How would we know when we've got there? How will we be able to measure success? Because it was this strange thing going on, and we were hearing odd things. I mean, with my IT contacts, I'd actually heard very early on in the process that things weren't all well in this process. So I'd been doing a lot of reading around this, and you know, quite frankly, by the time we got to the end of the process, guess what? We were, you know, those of us who had concerns about it were proved to be right, really. One really important thing, I think, for me, which a lot of techies who are involved in this sort of stuff is the need for an integrated end-to-end solution. The technology is important, but unless we've got the people and the expertise and the resources to tie all of this together, this end-to-end track trace system would never be very successful. So, you know, that came out, and that was really good. And for me, from a technical background, it was great being in an audience where the majority of people weren't technical. The majority of people had concerns and issues, and they were quite justified having those issues. So what it told me as somebody from the tech industry, how we fail generally in these types of projects, because we use language that, you know, I'm sorry, the average person on the street just doesn't understand. So it was really interesting for me from that point of view. I mean, in terms of the deliberation process, I think it's fantastic, and I'd like to see this type of process also being used in commercial environments, because as we move forward, again, following on from what Russell is saying, this is probably going to become the new normal for how we get around the table and discuss things. You know, this is going to be the way forward. The key thing, I think, based on some project meetings that I've been in that have gone on for like 9 hours or more, we need independent experts in the deliberation process. It's not enough for the project manager to be doing it, or, you know, whoever the business lead is. So that process was really interesting. I found it really challenging in some senses when you were trying to talk about some of the more softer things like values, because, you know, when you've spent all your time in a commercial IT environment, the idea of values, you know, you then start equating money to them. It's very hard. It's the intangible versus the tangible type values. So I really, you know, had to think really hard about that, which is great because I learned a lot, basically. I think that it was also interesting that a lot of us who signed up for this, I mean, I'd be the first to admit it, it was great. I'd been in lockdown. I've been in the same 4 walls for 12 weeks, and I thought, fantastic, an opportunity to meet new people. And it was great, actually. I mean, I found it very beneficial. In fact, the app itself, for me, started to recede into the distance, and I started to enjoy the conversation, because in society, we've got the pandemic, but we've also got a big issue around elderly care. So I spend a lot of time looking at technology and tools that can help me look after my dad. And so again, I just think that this type of deliberation around what we can do in many related fields is really interesting. So I would certainly get involved again, and I would recommend to anyone who gets the opportunity to join in, basically.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the role of independent experts, by the way, and I'm going to ask Natalie to come in on the role of independent expert, given understanding patient data's work as an independent organisation, thinking about the role of patient data and how that's governed. So Natalie, would you be able to offer some reflections? You did participate in this process as an expert as well.
Thanks very much, Rima. Yes, I did participate. So I'll talk a little bit through about sort of the methodology and the process, and then come on to some reflections, I think, on the content, and picking up a couple of the points that Mandy and Russell have already made. But first of all, kudos to the Ada Lovelace Institute, Traverse, Involve, and Bang the Table for managing to pull something on this together so quickly. I think the world was reeling from the pandemic and the impacts and the implications, and it took a great deal of foresight to be able to say, hang on a minute, we have the capacity to do something here and turn it around quickly, and actually create a deliberation and a process that could actually be really tangible and feasible in such a short space of time and under considerable pressure. So it was a huge challenge, not only logistically and in terms of design, to create a process like this, but also to sort of develop and refine the questions to make sure they could make a meaningful contribution to what is a very, very important area of debate and discussion, especially in light of how politically charged and rapidly evolving the whole environment is at the moment. And I wanted to just reflect on the comparison with other events that we've run in the past. As understanding patient data, we often either collate or commission public attitudes research ourselves. We did one last year that was published in March, which was exploring how people felt about NHS organisations partnering with third parties when it came to data. And by comparison, that process took months. It took a very long time to refine the research questions, to explore and have lots of back and forth with a wide range of stakeholders on what the key questions and priorities were. We also spent a long time developing case studies and materials to present to people for a citizens' jury deliberative process, which ran over sort of a compressed time frame of 2.5 days. They had several rounds of iteration, lots and lots of attention paid to whether they were fair and balanced, and we were presenting the sort of the case impartially. We spent a lot of time thinking about what questions people might have and trying to ensure we had all the materials to answer those questions, so that we could sort of be proactive in trying to address as many of the questions and challenges people would have about data use as possible. So that whole process was quite involved, it was quite intense, and there was a lot of consideration about how to frame the questions, exactly what to ask, and where we thought it could be most useful to inform policy thinking in particular. None of that is possible with a quick turnaround, but in a sense, it was quite refreshing to participate in the discussions on that basis, because frankly the participants were as knowledgeable as the rest of us. So I provided some input as someone who has some knowledge of the app in particular, but also the broader space around how data, and particularly health data, is being used by all sorts of different types of organisations, the NHS, but also commercial providers as well. But actually there were many unanswerable questions. I certainly didn't have answers to all the questions that people posed to me, and it did feel like there was a sense of, well, we're all trying to navigate this really complex, rapidly evolving environment together, and things were constantly shifting. And actually, I think that made the process much more reflective of the usual decision-making context that actually happens when it comes to, say, designing policy and governance and developing initiatives for the use of data. Sometimes deliberative processes can lead you to believe that all the answers are there and you just have to sort of find a way through them. But because we were navigating that complexity with only partial information, that sense of, well, we don't have answers to this, so what's the best we can do under those circumstances is quite helpful. Sometimes in these processes, at the end of it, you can end up with a kind of really idealistic wish list of things that you know in practice are not going to be feasible financially or in terms of the buy-in you're going to get, because the things that people want in an ideal world are, you know, much greater information provision, things like information campaigns, more accountability structures, that you just, you know, feasibly, they're not necessarily going to be things that can be picked up. Whereas through this process, because we were all in a situation of kind of only partial knowledge and lots of unanswered questions, it did feel a bit more realistic, messier, but much more realistic, and therefore much more reflective of what might actually be doable in practice. So I just found that quite interesting, and that was certainly unexpected. But I do think there's a major challenge of trying to operate these kinds of deliberative processes in an environment that is evolving so quickly, and both Russell and Mandy have kind of alluded to this, which is when we're trying to ask these really difficult societal questions around the role of technology, we are asking those questions before we know what the technology can actually do and whether it can work as intended. And these are very, very legitimate questions, because the context and the details matter. You know, Mandy's point, what does good look like? I don't think anyone knew going into this process quite what good would look like for the app. As it turns out, I think the promise of the technology, particularly in relation to the contact tracing app, was very overhyped. But the details and the evidence base really, really mattered. You know, the effectiveness of the technology is very important in considering trade-offs, risks, benefits, what you would or wouldn't be willing to do, who you would or wouldn't be willing to provide data to. Because if that is not going to work as advertised, that will of course affect how you make those trade-offs and what you consider is acceptable or not. So I do think there's a little risk when you're trying to run these processes in such a fast-paced environment where you don't necessarily understand or know or have evidence of what the technology can actually do, that you can get a little bit swept up in hypotheticals and the kind of conditionals, and well, if it does this, then this is how I feel about it. And when it's a bit too early to tell what the tech can do, you might lose the possibility of actually having the kind of impact that you're trying to achieve, because your focus is very much on the kind of, well, if this, then, you know, this is how I'd feel about it. And it might be helpful to policymakers and developers in terms of the kind of broad principles of what's necessary for, in this case, public confidence in these technologies. But you're really unable to get at that more granular level when it comes to what's necessary in this situation with this technology that works in this particular way, because you don't have the evidence base to know quite how it's working, how it would or could work. So you can have a very fascinating and important deliberation that does have value in and of itself, but that might not end up having the influence you intend, because, you know, as we saw from the app, actually that has decreased in importance now in terms of the test and trace program. And actually there you know, there's lots of broader considerations around kind of the society, the role of us individuals in society and how our data is used. But for that particular conversation about that particular technology, this process, it wasn't possible to get that kind of fine detailed insight into what people would or would not you know, find acceptable. So that's kind of one of the challenges, I think, of trying to operate in this space so quickly when the evidence base is changing quite rapidly. So I'll leave it there, but I'm very happy to kind of pick up on more conversations as we go. Thanks, Rena.
Thank you. I think those are really thoughtful reflections and observations on the difference between the types of deliberative processes that often run, and indeed we run citizen juries and citizen councils in particular. There are citizen biometric councils worth looking at, which is a much longer programme. And I think there's a really interesting question, which is about the design of these spaces in an online context, and also in particular some of the challenges and limitations around them, and in particular challenges for inclusion. And so I'm going to ask Anna to come in and talk a little bit about her thinking about the design of this process, which was quite unusual. Certainly, I've not worked on anything like this before. So it would be really great to hear your reflections on what worked, what could have been done differently, and in particular, the value of this and its constraints and its limitation too.
Sure, thanks Rima. And it's great to hear your voices again, Russell, Mandy and Natalie, it's nice to see you. So I'm just going to add a few reflections about actually the sort of use of technology in creating and designing civic or democratic spaces. And so in this project, what we really did was replace one space, an event space in a community hall, for example, with 3 different online civic spaces. And the reason for this is that we were running this as a deliberative process. So participants needed to be able to access information, reflect on that information, share their views, hear views that were different to their own, and then discuss all of that together. And so we needed multiple spaces online in order to do that. I'm just going to talk through those in a moment, but I wanted to pick up on a comment from Rima earlier, which was around this distributed structure and the platforms and how that gave us some flexibility to be able to change the course of the discussion. So within a usual process like this, you might have 1 full day or maybe 2 full days, but we sort of split it out across shorter sessions across 3 weeks. We had 7 sessions in all, and also the opportunities to use the online platform in the interim. So while it was certainly challenging in much uncertainty to steer the course of the discussion, we did have a bit of flexibility to be able to be responsive and reactive. Certainly didn't overcome all the challenges, but it is one thing that helped during the course of the process. So it did mean that we didn't necessarily need at the beginning to have decided everything that we were going to do. We could adapt as we went. So in terms of the spaces that we created, the first space was created with I guess we could call it the plenary space, and we did that using Zoom. And these were more akin to a webinar where guest speakers gave presentations. However, the civic space within that was really the chat function, as participants commented on what they were hearing, they challenged it, they built on each other's questions, and it was a little bit like Gogglebox, because usually we don't get to hear people's inner narratives when they're listening to a presentation, whereas in this way, we heard some of it and we heard how people shared it with others. So the second space we had was in the small discussion groups of 8 people, where participants talked together and they used the chat function as well. This was on Zoom, but this was more, if you like, a traditional discussion space. And the third space was the Engagement HQ online platform, where participants shared ideas, they commented on each other's ideas, liked them, shared experiences, completed polls, and that enabled the asynchronous contributions and meant that participants could drop in and out of the conversation. So the use of technology in this way allowed us to do some new things, as mentioned, but of course it also constrained us. For example, informal interactions that are still a really key part of our civic spaces, those chats over coffee, the one-on-one exchanges, that's not as possible using online technologies like this. And additionally, it was much more challenging to work collaboratively with participants on materials. So yes, there are platforms such as Mural and Google Jam and Miro, but we were aware that people would maybe be joining just using their phone. They wouldn't really perhaps quite have the setup to make participating across multiple platforms possible. So we didn't want to do that. We didn't use that as an option. And finally, of course, not everyone is online or confident with technology, so that provides a limitation in itself. However, I think the overarching lesson we took away from this process, both from some of the findings and how we delivered the process, is that focusing the conversation on the specific technology is too narrow. So one of the key things that we learned from participants, and I think Mandy mentioned some of this before, is that an app is not as important as having trust and understanding in the system that lies behind it. And so similarly, our focus with civic tech shouldn't just be on the tech or the ways in which it's different to face-to-face work. We need to look at the ways in which our civic processes and systems and spaces work and how they include and exclude people more generally. So one reflection we had at Traverse sort of in the kind of couple of weeks following the deliberation was that in some ways civic tech has developed alongside traditional engagement practice rather than always disrupting it. So everyone can log on and see council meetings streamed live these days, but I'm not sure that's really changed how council meetings work. So we think it's really important to provide people, perhaps with data-enabled tablets and support them in using these platforms that we're experimenting and enable digital inclusion. Of course, that's really important. But that won't be successful if people have no trust in the process that they're participating in, and they don't see the value that it gives to them and their communities. The question that I'm left with after running this project with all these brilliant collaborators who've given so much to it over the last few weeks is how we can use this opportunity not just to replicate things online, but to use technology to transform our civic and democratic processes for the better, and to interrogate the views and structures that resist some of those changes. I'm going to leave it there for now. There's so much more that we could say, but I know we want to get into some questions, so I'll hand back over to Rima.
That's really great, and please do pop additional questions in the chat, although we've got a fair few already, and in particular one for Mandy and Russell, I think, which is, through the process, was there reflection on public sharing of data, depending on whether it's going to a private company or the state, and you know, any differences in views on that? That would be really interesting. Yeah. So Russell first, and then Mandy. I think that's probably the best order.
Yeah, sure. I think there was a lot of worry. There was a particular guy in our group about private companies, and he sort of came up with some names of private companies that he thought might be involved. And I think there was a real worry that would be the case. You know, I think a more centralised system would probably be better. I think that was probably what came across on that.
You're on mute, Rima.
Of course.
Sorry.
I was just about to say, could you say a little bit more about the basis upon which that consideration was arrived at? So the reasons for why people felt that they...
Me or Russell? Russell.
Yeah, I suppose because they weren't sure about how people, you know, once it goes behind a closed door, what's going to happen with their data. You know, what are their agendas with the data? Obviously, they're going to make money from the data, you know, and sort of people felt that wasn't quite right in this aspect. So I think they were the main issues, really. Yeah.
And Mandy?
I think having watched various blogs and Twitter feeds and God knows what around the app and data during this process, I think a lot of these concerns about data were driven by some really bizarre conspiracy theories that were doing the rounds, and they certainly didn't help. And, you know, I again feel reasonably comfortable when it comes to some aspects of commercial versus government. My concern, whoever it is that the framework needs to be in place to protect our information and to look after it and to adhere to appropriate legislation, basically. And I know that certainly last year, a lot of us got upset when our health minister managed to sell off loads of our data. And I think that upset and made people feel very uncomfortable. So for me, it was a bit of both, basically.
Thank you. I mean, I think there's a really interesting question which relates to building confidence and competencies when it comes to the use of technology in deliberative discussion, and how we best do that. And indeed, whether that's an important thing to do. And I'd like to ask Anna and then Natalie to reflect on that.
Yeah, I think it is really important. We would have liked to do more of it, to be honest. I think I sort of mentioned briefly when I was speaking before that supporting people who are digitally excluded and providing them with the technology and onboarding them just to be able to use that in their lives, not just to take part in a process like this, would have been something we'd have loved to do in the forerunner to this project. We were just constrained by time and resources in this instance. It's something that we're looking at in our work more generally, and we think that's really important. what we tried to do within this project, within how constrained we were, is we kept the platforms as simple as we could. So we didn't work across multiple platforms. We chose a video conferencing platform that we thought was most likely to have been used by some people at least. We didn't ask people to do too much to do things at the same time. And we tried to encourage people to feel comfortable in their surroundings as much as possible. Usually people had their video on, sometimes they had it off. But if there was interruptions, if there were kids, if there were dogs, that kind of thing, it wasn't an issue. And we talked people through any technical issues as we went. We tried to troubleshoot things with people as we went. And we found that in this process, while some people had connectivity issues, which occasionally meant they dropped out of sessions, it wasn't a barrier to them completing the entire process. So there might be an issue that happened one day, but we tended to be able to fix it the next time. But I think there is always more you can do in that. And certainly within this project, we barely scratched the surface.
Natalie?
Sorry, thanks very much. I think Anna's covered it pretty well from the context of this particular deliberation and trying to kind of build confidence and competence for participating in this sort of process. But I would say kind of more broadly around digital skills and participation, that there is a real challenge of, if you're starting from the system perspective and like you're wanting to get people to do stuff, you're always going to have challenges because you're not starting from where people are at and the questions that they have and what matters to them and what's important to them. And I think if you can kind of flip that process on its head and say, well, what matters to you, and is digital tools and technologies and participation going to help you address and deal with and manage the things that you care about, then I think you're starting from you've got a much better starting point for actually engaging with people and creating tools that are and processes that are going to be beneficial for them. So it is a little bit of flipping that starting point on its head for trying to address those sorts of questions.
Thank you. So I had a question which I had promised I would raise, which is about the one key idea Mandy and Russell would want to pitch to a policymaker or politician if they had the opportunity from the deliberative process. Would you be able to share what that is? Mandy first and then Russell.
Well, for me, with my project manager hat on, if I had the chance to sit down in front of these people, I'd like to understand what their planning process is. Because we've not seen any plan, we've not seen any briefing document, and normally any project would have a brief that would identify objectives, requirements, risks, issues, mitigation. And if that was made available, I think people would have more confidence in what they were trying to do. So for me, that's what I would ask them, to be transparent about their decision-making processes and the thinking behind, this app or any future apps.
Thank you. Russell?
Yeah, sure. So I think I would probably want to ask someone that if this is still actually going to happen, if this track and trace system, that can get society going back, is it still going to be something that's going to be worked on? Because it feels like it's stopped a little bit, and if anything's going backwards a little bit. So, and obviously for this this period now, but also looking into the future, if this happens again or a second wave, are we going to be ready for that time as well?
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So we've got a question which is about whether the public had an understanding about decentralised versus centralised, and any kind of reflections or observations about that part of the process. Mandy, would you be able to answer that very quickly?
I would suggest that perhaps the general public didn't, quite frankly. And to be honest, it never actually featured very high in my mental thought processes. But there are big issues around, depending on the choice you make. So I'm sure Natalie would probably appreciate, because a lot of medical and health data is being delivered via apps, managed via apps at the moment. But I would say I don't think the public generally understood the difference.
Thank you. We've got some quite technical questions about how people were supported to get onto the platform, and if they were not able to access the platform, a question about whether the summary of the technical issues encountered during the engagement participation and any lessons learned as well, and in general, a kind of question about whether the discussion was being recorded and how people felt about being on the record. And I'm going to ask Anna to respond to those.
5 in 1. Okay, so one of them from Susanna I tried to answer in the chat, which is around how the platform was used by participants. So I've typed the answer to that. I hope that's covered the question. Please let me know. If not, happy to talk about that more. Just drop me an email at another time if that's useful for anyone. In terms of supporting participants to use the platform, we sent joining instructions with screenshots over email, and it's a relatively intuitive platform, and we basically said at any point if you've got any problems, just email us and let us know. We didn't actually have anybody emailing us to say that they were struggling to join the platform, and everybody joined the platform. That was remarkably smooth. I don't know whether that was just an accident, but that was a remarkably smooth process. In terms of the technical issues that we encountered, we asked participants about this. We asked participants about whether they found any barriers to participation in general, and the only barrier that people mentioned was when they had connectivity issues. It was actually the only technical issue that they brought up, and that sometimes meant that they struggled joining a Zoom call, or they were on the call and things were kind of going in and out and they missed things. What we tried to do to cover that was, I mentioned this briefly in my response to Susanna, was the online platform enabled us to post the slides. We did live note taking in the plenary sessions and in the discussion sessions, with the slides and the notes on the online platform for people to look in their own time. Some people like that because they found it a lot to absorb there and then, and they wanted to go back and look at it, and they appreciated the time to be able to do that. Some people, if they'd had to miss a session for whatever reason, then caught up, as it were. So that was a helpful way, and I think in terms of helping people overcome connectivity issues, other than addressing the actual technology they have in the home, which of course is an option if you're doing something, that's under more that needs to ensure people can participate in that way. I think giving people the opportunity to find the information and go back to the information in their own time was helpful for that. Was the discussion recorded? That was the other question. So we recorded the plenary sessions where specialists were speaking, and not all of them actually, only 2 of them, and we posted that. And the way we handled that with people is that if we just told them we were recording and they turned their videos off. And usually when we were in plenary with slides, you wouldn't have picked people's faces imaged anyway. But we just said if they've got any concerns about it, just turn their videos off. We didn't record the discussion sessions. We instead, as I said, we had note takers on the call with us who were taking verbatim notes at the same time. So we had effectively an immediate transcription available for our kind of analysis purposes and also for the participants. That covered it all.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question, which is whether the lack of evidence and information during the deliberation process is a challenge to policymakers to be more open and provide the information citizens need to evaluate and get to grips with and inform public debate about new technology. And then how could that work when the policy and technology is being developed in tandem, but often tech providers may have less incentive to be transparent than government bodies. And I'm going to ask Natalie to have a go at that one.
Big question. Thanks, Rima. This is a huge challenge, especially as you say, when things are being developed in tandem. My own view is that the worst thing to do is to say, don't worry, we've got it covered, we'll tell you when we figured everything out, because I don't think that is an environment that is conducive to trust. In a context in which you're developing things that are going to rapidly iterate, where you're going to have to make decisions quickly, possibly pivot those decisions, change your mind on things because in light of new evidence and shift direction of travel, I think you can only do that if you have created an environment of a kind of architecture of trust and trustworthiness. So saying at the outset, right, here is something we're going to try. We don't know if it's going to work. This is a bit of an experiment. and we want to try and develop it in a way that's going to take account of the potential for exclusion. We're mindful of inequalities, and all these sorts of things. If you can create that environment at the outset and say, we're going to give this a go, we need your buy-in and your support for us to do this, and in exchange we will make sure we are open and honest about the decision-making process, who's accountable for those decisions, where you can find information if you want more. There will be questions we can't answer yet, but we'll do our best. I would imagine most people would think, okay, give it a go, and if you're going to make mistakes, we will understand that those mistakes are being made. But if you don't set that environment out at the start, it makes it incredibly difficult. You're accused of U-turns on things if you change your mind, rather than saying this is a natural part of an iterative process, that we're shifting direction and doing things slightly differently. And I don't, to be frank, think this government has taken on that idea of openness and transparency and caring about trustworthiness as a feature of the system. The focus has been on world-beating system that is going to be in place by May, June, July, not sure when. And I just think that is absolutely toxic from the perspective of trust of citizens. So I would say creating an environment that's more conducive to trust at the outset is a critical part, where you're developing policy and technology in tandem with one another, and you have to have a constantly evolving process.
Thank you. And that links beautifully to what I think is going to be the last question, which is about public trust and how that is shaped by crises. So one person is asking, how would you compare the use of digital technologies and its relationship to public trust in comparison to previous large-scale crises, for instance, after 9/11, but we can think about other crises as well, more recently 2008 financial crisis, and so on. And I'm going to actually leave it open to whoever wants to answer that to come in, because I'm conscious it's a big one.
I don't mind giving it a go, and I'll let others mull it over for a little bit if that's helpful. I think there's several things that are different about the evolution and development of digital technologies and public trust that make it differ from kind of other crisis situations. One is, in a sense, although this stuff is developing rapidly, it's still a relatively slow burn compared to a sudden crisis such as 9/11 or the financial crash and so on. Data has been used by companies, by governments. These technologies have been in development over the past decade or more. We are slowly waking up to the fact that data is being used in all sorts of ways that we might not have anticipated. But in a sense, the problems of it are not new. They might be more prominent, and the profile around them has certainly risen in light of COVID and in light of the discussions we're having now. But they're not they haven't completely come as a bolt from the blue. And there's been a huge amount of work that has been done on questions around privacy, around equity, around ensuring what could be done to try and ensure that those technologies are developed in a good way. I don't think they always have been by any stretch, and I think some of the discussions that are emerging at the moment about particularly racist technologies and algorithmic bias and so on are very, very pertinent. But in a sense, those problems are not completely new. They have been developing over time. The other thing I think I'd say is the really interesting contrast, or perhaps it's not a contrast, between the role of commercial providers and governments and health systems in all of this. So, historically, there's been big questions around how companies are managing and using data. We're learning from things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal and so on that, data brokering and data harvesting is really big business. But typically, government's been a little more trusted, I think, and particularly the health system has been more trusted in using data. And I wonder if that is now being challenged somewhat, and actually with questions around government surveillance and so on, and potentially how where governments might be wanting to use data that's being collected for criminal justice purposes and those sorts of things. Maybe that dynamic of a difference between commercial providers and government providers is not as stark as it perhaps used to be. And so I do think there's a slight difference there, perhaps in previous crises, where we would turn to government for leadership in this space. Maybe people are questioning that a little bit more now. But that is a very, very off-the-cuff response.
Thank you. And Anna?
Just a quick thought, actually, which builds off the back of Natalie's point. I think I just reflect on what some of the things I was reflecting on earlier, in that when we were having this discussion, at no point, what the conversation about trust wasn't necessarily about the app on your phone. The conversation about trust exploded when Dominic Cummings went to Barnard Castle. And that Monday was when we had a discussion group after the press conference in the garden. That was, the conversation was about trust then. It wasn't about the technology. It was about, are we all in this together? It was about transparency and the behavior of our leaders and all of this kind of thing. And so for me, it's about these underpinning infrastructure systems, leaders, and the trust that is in, inherent in those, rather than, and if that is there, then the trust in the technology, you think will probably then come from that. And so our experience on this project was that when the conversation about trust exploded, it was after that event. It was rumbling, but after that event, it became a really dominant narrative. Brilliant,
thank you very much. And I think that was a very good attempt at quite a challenging question. I'm conscious of time. There are a couple of questions left. What I'm going to do is flag that, because both of those questions relate to impact on the policy-making process, that we will be publishing the findings from this work. We're having conversations with a range of government organisations about the insights from this work in order to influence and shape and change policy across the UK. And then the other aspects to this is that there will be a policy stakeholder roundtable. So do get in touch with us if that's something you're interested in contributing to and participating in and learning more from the published findings of this work. I'm hoping you found it valuable. I've been really impressed at the number of people that have actually stayed on this call for the duration of it. So I'm thinking that's probably a good sign. Got a very high ratio there. I just want to say a huge thanks to Russell, Mandy, Natalie and Anna for everything, and also to you for your excellent questions. The conversation is not over, and we will be obviously sharing more in due course. Thank you very much, and have a good day, good week. See you. Bye.